A black teenager sits quietly in business class. A white executive points at him and says 4 words that silence the entire cabin. He took my watch. Atlanta Hartsfield Jackson never really sleeps, but at 6:42 in the morning it comes closest to trying. The terminal lights hum the way fluorescent lights always do, that flat, colorless buzz that makes everyone look a little sick and a little tired, which is accurate because everyone is. Travelers drag roller bags across polished floors. A toddler cries somewhere near gate C18. A janitor pushes a mop in slow, patient circles that nobody notices. These are the kinds of black stories that don't make the news. Real-life stories that happen in the margins, in the spaces between departures, in the quiet moments before everything changes. Malik Thompson is 16 years old, and he is trying very hard not to be here. He sits in a plastic gate chair with his backpack between his feet, a worn copy of The Invisible Man open across his knees, noise-canceling headphones pulled over his ears. The hoodie he's wearing is faded navy blue with Howard printed in white across the chest, the lettering slightly cracked at the edges from too many washes. His sneakers are clean but not new. His face is the face of someone who reads instead of talking, who notices instead of reacting, who has learned early that the world tends to misunderstand quiet black boys, and that the safest response to that fact is more quiet. He is not reading, he is watching. Denise Thompson sits beside him in her nursing scrubs, a thin coat pulled over her shoulders, because she came straight from her shift and didn't have time to change. She is 44 years old, and she looks at today in a way she doesn't always, the kind of tired that sits behind the eyes instead of on the face. She has her phone in her lap, and she is staring at a photo she's pulled up and put down twice already. Her sister Beverly. Taken 3 days ago at 61, which was too young, which was always going to feel too young, no matter how many times Denise had tried to prepare herself. The flight to Chicago boards in 20 minutes. She taps Malik's arm, and he pulls one side of his headphones off. She says she upgraded them. Business class. Used the points she's been saving since his freshman year. He looks at her. He starts to say something, and then doesn't. She says she knows he didn't want to come. She says Aunt Bev loved him, and that's the only reason they're here. He nods once, puts the headphone back, looks at his book without reading it. Denise reaches over and squeezes his hand through the fabric of his hoodie sleeve. He lets her. 3 rows of seats away near the charging station, a woman named Tiffany Cole is already live. She is 29, mixed race, with natural hair pinned up and a ring light clipped to her phone case, and she has been narrating airport content for 4 years to an audience that currently sits at 847,000 followers across platforms. Right now, she has 14,000 people watching her say things like, "Oh, we are in the business class lounge energy today," not actually in the lounge but adjacent to the lounge, which is a vibe. And her comments are filling up with laughing emojis and people tagging their friends. The camera is on a swivel mount on her carry-on handle. It has been rolling since she got out of the lift. It will not stop rolling for the next 2 hours. Richard Holloway arrives at the gate at 7:03, 5 minutes before boarding, which is exactly how men like Richard Holloway arrive at things. He is 58, silver-haired, in the way that reads as distinguished rather than old, wearing a suit that costs more than most people's rent. He moves through the gate area the way people move through spaces they consider inconveniences, briskly, without eye contact, expecting the path to clear, and it does. People step aside without knowing they're doing it. He has a Rolex Daytona on his left wrist, the steel and gold version, the kind that runs about $40,000 on the secondary market. It catches the fluorescent light as he reaches past Malik's backpack to grab a spot at the charging station. He doesn't say, "Excuse me." He doesn't look at Malik. He doesn't look at anything that doesn't require his attention. Malik watches him from behind the headphones, files it away, says nothing. Boarding starts at 7:08. The business class cabin is 6 rows, 2 seats on each side, muted gray upholstery and small reading lights. Malik takes the window in 3C backpack stowed overhead headphones, back on book open in his lap. Denise settles in beside him in 3B. Across the aisle in 3A, Richard Holloway drops into his seat with the ease of a man who has sat in this exact type of seat hundreds of times. He is already on his phone before the armrest is down. His voice is low, but the cabin is quiet. and Malik hears fragments without meaning to. The accounts need to move before we land. Tell Marcus the timeline holds. His tone is clipped, the words precise, the kind of conversation designed to sound like nothing while meaning something specific. Holloway ends the call, glances at his watch. Olivia Bennett moves through the cabin doing pre-departure checks, a flight attendant with 11 years on the job, the kind of professional competence that looks effortless because it isn't. She notices Malik the way she notices all her passengers and gives him a small smile. He nods without looking up from his book. She moves on. Holloway snaps his fingers, not loudly, just enough. Olivia turns. He wants a drink before the doors close. She recovers the small flinch in her expression and says, "Of course," and means it. At 7:14, 6 minutes before scheduled departure, Holloway glances at his wrist again. And again. His right hand moves to the inner breast pocket of his jacket. His fingers press against the fabric. Then he goes very still. He turns his head, slowly, and he looks across the aisle at Malik Thompson. Malik is reading. Or he appears to be reading. He is not moved. Holloway stands. He doesn't lower his voice. "Excuse me. That boy. He was right next to me during boarding. My Rolex is gone. The cabin doesn't go silent. It goes aware. The particular awareness of strangers who have suddenly become witnesses, who feel something shift without knowing what, who look up without knowing why." A woman stops scrolling. A man lowers his newspaper. The air changes the way air changes before weather. Olivia freezes for exactly 2 seconds. 2 seconds in which every piece of training she has collides with every instinct she has, and neither one wins cleanly. Across the aisle, Denise Thompson looks up from her phone. Malik takes off his headphones, slowly. One side, then the other. He sets them around his neck. His face gives away nothing, but his jaw tightens just barely, just once. Holloway says he is not making accusations. He says he is stating facts. He says the watch was on his wrist at the gate and now it isn't, and this boy was standing right beside him. He says it the way people say things when they have already decided. Calm, certain. The kind of certainty that doesn't need to be loud because it has never had any reason to doubt itself. Malik does not speak. He does not look away. The question that settles over that cabin, unspoken and absolute, is the same question that has hung over 1,000 rooms before this one. In courtrooms and classrooms and break rooms and boardrooms, in every space where a black boy has had to stand still while someone decided what kind of person he was. Will anyone on this plane believe a 16-year-old in a worn hoodie over a man in a $5,000 suit? The doors are still open. The plane has not moved. But something already has. Olivia moved into the galley fast, the way people move when they need 30 seconds to figure out what they're supposed to do next. She picked up the radio and called for Jerome, and she kept her voice level because that was her job, keeping her voice level, even when everything inside her was not. Jerome Whitfield came forward from the rear cabin. 52 years old, 23 years with the airline, a man who had seen enough in 2 decades of this work to read a room the way other people read headlines. He stepped into the galley, looked at Olivia, and then looked through the curtain into the business class cabin without being obvious about it. He didn't need to be told what was happening. He could feel it, the way you feel a change in cabin pressure before anyone says a word. He said they needed to be careful. She said she knew. They went back in together. Holloway had settled into a particular kind of performance, by then the kind that looks like restraint but is actually confidence wearing restraint as a costume. He had his hands folded on the armrest and his voice was measured, and he said he was not trying to make this a whole thing. He said he just wanted his property back. He said it in the tone of a man who had decided that reasonableness was more effective than anger, which was true, and which was also the most dangerous version of what was happening. From seat 2B, a woman in a cream blazer looked up briefly from the magazine in her lap. She said they should just check. She said it like it was obvious, like it was nothing. Then she went back to her reading. Olivia walked to row 3. She stopped in front of Malik. She kept her voice low, which was the right instinct, even if the result was the same as if she'd said it at full volume, because the cabin was quiet enough that everyone heard her anyway. She said she was sorry. She said, would he mind if they took a look at his carry-on just to rule it out? Malik didn't move. He turned his head and looked at his mother. Denise Thompson stood up. She didn't raise her voice, which took visible effort. She said absolutely not. She said they didn't have the right. She said her son has not touched anything that doesn't belong to him. Holloway didn't raise his voice either. That was the thing that made Denise's hands curl at her sides. He said gently, patiently, "Ma'am, I'm not talking to you." He said he was talking to airline staff. He let a beat past the kind of beat that's designed to feel like civility, and then he said he just wanted this resolved before takeoff, and he was sure it was a misunderstanding. That word settled into the cabin like something dropped from a height. Misunderstanding. Not accusation, not mistake. Misunderstanding. As if the situation were simply confused, as if the facts just needed to be sorted out, as if a 16-year-old boy with a worn backpack and a Howard hoodie had simply failed to understand that he was sitting in the wrong seat, in the wrong skin at the wrong time of morning. Jerome put a hand up low at his side, a gesture meant only for Denise. He said quietly, "Let me handle this." His eyes told her the rest. He'd been in rooms like this before. He knew what pushing back right now would cost and what it wouldn't get. Denise sat down. It cost her something. The way her jaw set and her hands folded in her lap and her spine went perfectly, terribly straight, that was the cost, right there visible to anyone paying attention. Across the aisle in 4A, Tiffany Cole had angled her phone downward against the tray table lens, facing forward, looking like nothing, recording everything. Her viewer count had climbed to 21,000. She typed into the caption without looking at the screen. She typed, "This is not okay." She typed, "Watch this." Malik stood up. He didn't wait for Olivia to ask again. He reached up and unlatched the overhead bin himself, pulled his backpack down and set it on his seat. His movements were slow and deliberate and controlled in a way that a person only learns by practicing it, by deciding that control is the only thing nobody can take from you. He unzipped the main compartment and held it open. There were 2 textbooks, a pre-calculus and an AP history. There was a charging cable coiled neatly around itself. There was a worn Bible with a ribbon bookmark, the kind of Bible that has been read with a small note tucked inside the front cover in Denise's handwriting that said, "God goes before you." There was a spiral notebook dense with equations. There was a sandwich in a Ziploc bag, turkey on wheat. There was no Rolex. Holloway looked at the contents of the bag. He did not say he was sorry. He did not look embarrassed. What he said was check his jacket. Olivia went still. Jerome's expression didn't change, but something in his posture did some small, precise thing that only someone watching closely would catch. Jerome said, "Sir, we've checked the bag. There's nothing here." Holloway glanced toward Denise. He said the boy could have passed it to someone. He said it calmly. He said it as if it were a reasonable thing to say. He looked at Denise Thompson, a woman in nursing scrubs who had worked a 12-hour shift and was on her way to bury her sister, and he suggested without saying it directly that she might be part of it. A few people in the cabin looked away. A few didn't. Malik rezipped his backpack. He lifted it back into the overhead bin. He latched it shut. He sat down, reached to the seat back pocket and took out his book. He found his page. He opened to it. He did not look at Holloway. He did not look at Olivia. He did not look at anyone. He read. Or he held the book and looked at it, and whatever was happening inside him, he kept it exactly there inside, where nobody in that cabin could reach it or use it against him. Tiffany's chat was moving so fast the comments blurred. "This is racial profiling. Why is nobody saying anything? Is that a Bible in his bag? Someone get this on Twitter." A man in 5A had his own phone out, now angled toward the front of the cabin. In seat 4C, a woman with white hair and a cardigan met Malik's eyes for a moment and gave him a small, slow nod. He didn't respond, but he saw her. Denise sat with her hands folded and her eyes forward. Her lips moved slightly, just slightly, and it was impossible to tell from 2 feet away whether she was praying or whether she was holding back every word she had decided she could not afford to say out loud. Possibly she was doing both. She was capable of both. Holloway flagged Olivia again. He wanted that drink. Then the intercom clicked on. The captain's voice came through, unhurried, professionally neutral, the voice of someone reading from a script that had not been written yet. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been asked to hold at the gate. Please remain seated. No explanation, no timeline, no reason given. The doors stayed open." Nobody told them anything. That was the part that settled into the cabin like weight, not the holding, but the silence around it. The captain had said, "Please remain seated," and then the intercom had clicked off, and now there was just the ambient hum of a plane that wasn't going anywhere. And outside the windows, the tarmac sat gray and still under a sky that hadn't decided yet whether it was morning. Malik had his book open. His thumb moved along the bottom edge of the spine back and forth, a slow automatic motion that had nothing to do with reading. His eyes were on the page. His breathing was even. Anyone watching him from a distance would have said the boy was fine, was calm, was reading. Anyone watching closely would have noticed the thumb. Denise noticed. She always noticed. She leaned toward him slightly, not enough to draw attention, and said his name low the way she said it when she needed him to hear her and not the room. He turned just enough. She said Georgetown called again. Last week. She said she hadn't told him yet because of everything with Beverly and she didn't want to add to it, but she was telling him now because she needed him to remember what was waiting for him on the other side of this flight. He looked at her for a moment, then he looked back at his book. He said he hadn't told anyone at school yet about the scholarship. She asked why not, and he was quiet for a few seconds, and then he said, "They look at him different when they know." He said it simply without bitterness, the way you state a fact you have verified enough times that it no longer surprises you. Denise absorbed that. She didn't argue with it because she couldn't. She said quietly that he had worked for this. She said it belonged to him. He nodded once. His thumb kept moving along the spine. Then she said, and her voice dropped lower, that he needed to stay calm. She said he knew why they couldn't make noise right now. She said he knew what was at stake, and that the people who needed to know already knew, and that it was almost over. He turned and looked at her fully this time. Something passed between them that had the shape of an old conversation, one they had been having in pieces for 8 months, in kitchens, in cars, in hospital waiting rooms, in the specific language of people who have learned to say everything important without saying it directly. He said he knew. She held his gaze for one more second, and then looked away back toward the front of the cabin, her spine straight, her hands folded. In the galley, Olivia was straightening napkins that did not need to be straightened. She had folded the same one 3 times. Jerome stood in the galley entrance with his arms crossed and his voice low. He said she knew what she had just done. She said she had followed protocol. She said there was an accusation and a passenger, and she had followed the steps she was trained to follow. Jerome said she had followed him. He didn't say Holloway's name. He didn't need to. Olivia didn't answer. She set the napkin down flat and smoothed it with her palm. Jerome didn't push. He had made his point, and he was not the kind of man who made a point twice when once was enough. He stood there for another moment, and then he looked through the gap in the galley curtain toward row 3. Malik was still holding his book, still breathing, still there. Olivia looked too. She stood there looking at a 16-year-old boy who had just had his backpack searched in front of 40 people, and had then sat back down and opened his book to the right page, and the guilt that moved through her was not the clean, manageable kind. It was the kind that finds the specific place where your good intentions live and sits down next to them and stays. She was a single mother. She had a 7-year-old daughter at home with her own mother right now, waiting for Olivia to come home from a 4-day rotation. She had been on probationary status since March, since a passenger had filed a complaint that was vague enough to be impossible to disprove, and her supervisor had said one more incident, and they would have to have a different conversation. She had told herself this morning that she just needed to get through the week. She understood, standing in that galley, that understanding why you made a choice did not change what the choice had cost someone else. Back in the cabin, Holloway said something to no one in particular, just loud enough that this was why he flew private. From 3D, a younger man who had been silent the entire time looked up from his laptop. He was maybe 30 in a flannel shirt, and he said without looking away from his screen, "Then why aren't you?" It landed the way quiet things land when a room is already listening. A sound came from somewhere near the back, not quite a laugh, something shorter. Holloway's jaw moved. He looked at his phone. Something he read made him go still in a specific way, not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of a man recalibrating. His thumb scrolled once and stopped. He flagged Olivia when she came back through. He said he needed to speak to the captain. He said it was important. He said, Tell him Richard Holloway needs 2 minutes and he'll know who I am. Olivia said she would check. She went forward. She came back. She said the captain was not available. Holloway looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes that was not quite anger and not quite fear, and was possibly the first honest thing his face had shown since he boarded. He said nothing. He turned back to the window. In row 3, Denise reached over and took Malik's hand. She didn't say anything. She just held it. The book stayed open in his other hand. After a long moment, he said barely above a whisper that he wasn't scared. She said she knew. A beat, just the hum of the plane and the sound of the terminal outside and 40 strangers pretending not to listen. She said, "That's what scares me." He looked at her. She looked back at him. Neither of them looked away. Across the aisle, Tiffany Cole lowered her phone for the first time since the gate. It was still recording. She just wasn't watching the screen anymore. She was watching them. Her comments were still filling up the numbers, still climbing, but for a moment she was not a creator, and they were not content. They were just a mother and her son holding on. Then Malik looked past his mother through the window, and something changed in his face. Not much, just enough. 2 black SUVs had pulled onto the tarmac below, moving without sirens, which somehow made them faster looking. Men in dark jackets climbed out before the vehicles fully stopped. They were not walking. The jetway door opened before anyone in the cabin had time to prepare for it. 3 men came through single file, moving with the specific economy of people who do not rush because they do not need to. The one in front was black, maybe 40, with a jaw that looked like it had been set into position and left there. His jacket said nothing, but his badge said everything, clipped to his belt and visible without being displayed the way federal agents wear them when they want to be understood without being theatrical. His name was Marcus Hill, and he had been awake since 4 a.m., and he showed none of it. The cabin reacted the way crowds react to something they don't have language for yet. People shifted. A woman in 2A put her hand on the arm of the child beside her without looking at the child. The man in 5A lowered his phone. Someone in the back said something too low to hear, and nobody answered. Tiffany's viewer count was at 47,000. The comments had stopped being sentences. They were fragments, now all caps, the kind of typing people do when their hands are ahead of their thoughts. They called the feds on a kid. This country is broken. Someone tell me this isn't happening. The numbers kept climbing. Holloway straightened in his seat. Just slightly. Just enough. He allowed himself a small adjustment of expression, not a smile, something more controlled than that the particular look of a man who has played a hand and is watching it pay out. He folded his hands in his lap and waited. Denise's hand found Malik's arm. Hill walked up the aisle. He passed row 5, row 4. He passed Holloway in 3A without slowing. He passed Malik in 3C without looking at him. He took 2 more steps toward the front of the cabin, and then he stopped. He turned around. He looked at 3A. He said, "Mr. Richard Holloway." It was not a question. The stillness that followed was different from all the other stillnesses that had settled over that cabin in the last 20 minutes. Those had been the stillness of discomfort, of people who didn't know what to do with what they were seeing. This was the stillness of a room that has just understood that it had the story wrong. Holloway's expression held for 2 more seconds. Then it changed. Not dramatically. Just a small, precise shift behind the eyes, the kind of thing you only catch if you are already watching for it. He said, "I'm sorry, do you know who I am?" Hill said, "Yes, sir. That's why we're here." The second agent had already moved to stand beside 3A, not touching Holloway, not blocking him, just present in the way that makes all other options feel theoretical. The third agent stood at the front of the aisle near the galley. Holloway switched gears the way men like him switch gears smoothly without acknowledging that a gear had been changed. He said he would need to call his attorney. His voice was still level. He was still performing just for a different audience, now performing composure, performing the confidence of a man who has lawyers for exactly this kind of situation. Hill said he could do that at the field office. Holloway looked around the cabin then, and it was the first time since he had boarded that his eyes moved across those faces, not to command them, but to read them, to take inventory, to assess. Whatever he found there, he kept the result to himself. Hill turned slightly toward the cabin. When he spoke, it was measured and brief, the tone of someone who has explained things in charged rooms before and has learned that less is more. He said there was a federal investigation ongoing and that a material witness aboard this aircraft required protection. He said the delay would be brief, and he thanked them for their patience. That was all he said. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. He walked to row 3 and crouched down at the aisle, bringing himself to eye level with the boy in 3C. It was a deliberate thing, that crouch. A choice about how to occupy space in relation to a 16-year-old who had been standing in front of other people's assumptions all morning. He said, "You're safe. We've had eyes on this flight since Atlanta." Malik looked at him. He nodded once. It was the nod of someone receiving confirmation, not information. He had known something was coming. He had not known the hour. 8 months ago, Malik Thompson had stayed late after school to meet with his counselor about a summer program application. On the way home, he had cut through the industrial blocks near his uncle's storage facility on the south side of Atlanta because it was faster and he knew the route. What he had seen through the gap in the loading dock door had not looked like much at first. Men he didn't know moving cases between vehicles. His uncle standing to the side with his phone out, not on a call, just holding it. A man in a suit Malik didn't recognize at the time, but would recognize later, much later, from a photograph his counselor showed him in a room with a federal agent and a lot of careful words. He had told his counselor the next morning because something about it had sat wrong all night and he had learned to trust the things that sit wrong. The counselor had made a call. The call had led to another call. 6 weeks later, Malik and Denise had sat in a federal building downtown, and a woman with a badge had explained what protected witness status meant and what it required and what it could not guarantee. Denise had held it together through the entire meeting. She had cried in the car afterward quietly with Malik sitting beside her, not saying anything because there was nothing to say. She had been holding it ever since. The Howard hoodie, the worn backpack, the unremarkable everything. It had not been accidental. The agents had advised it, and Malik had understood it intuitively the way he understood most things, the way a boy who has spent his whole life being overlooked understands that invisibility properly managed is a form of protection. The funeral trip had been real. Beverly had been real. But the timing had not been coincidental. Getting Malik out of Atlanta before a scheduled grand jury date had been the quieter reason underneath the grief. The third agent moved to Holloway's row. Standard procedure, he said, and began a methodical check of the jacket still folded across Holloway's armrest. Holloway watched this with his hands flat on his thighs. The agent's hand stopped at the inner breast pocket. He reached in. He removed something and set it on the armrest beside Holloway's elbow with a sound that was very small and very loud at the same time. A Rolex Daytona. Steel and gold. The second hand still moving. The cabin did not make a sound. Holloway had seen Malik at the gate. He had recognized him from the photograph his own attorneys had shown him 3 weeks ago, flagged as someone to be aware of. He had made a calculation in the time it takes to walk from a charging station to a jetway door. He had slipped the watch into his breast pocket and waited until they were seated, and then he had done what men who are cornered do when they still believe they have options. He had improvised. He had pointed. Every person in that cabin understood this now. They understood it in sequence the way a picture comes into focus, and when it was complete, there was nothing to say that would have been adequate, so nobody said anything. Olivia stood at the galley curtain. She looked at the watch on the armrest. She looked at Malik. He was not looking at her. He was looking out the window, his face turned away, his hand still in his mother's. Holloway stood when Hill indicated he should. He straightened his jacket out of habit. He walked up the aisle with an agent on each side, not touching him, just present. He did not look at Malik. He did not look at Denise. He looked at the floor in front of his feet, and he walked. Tiffany's phone caught his face as he passed row 2. She wasn't typing. She wasn't narrating. She just held the frame steady. The live stream was at 89,000 viewers. The jetway door closed behind them. For a moment, nobody moved at all. The cabin held the silence, the way a room holds smoke distributed evenly impossible to avoid. Then someone coughed, and someone else shifted in their seat, and the spell broke. The way spells break, not all at once, but in pieces, person by person, each one returning to their body and their phone and their particular version of what they had just witnessed. The man in 5A was already typing. Both thumbs fast, the way people type when they're trying to get to something before it gets away from them. He had footage. He had been recording since before the agents boarded, and he knew what he had, and he was not waiting. In seat 4C, the grandmother with the white hair and the cardigan was crying. Not loudly. Just steadily, the kind of crying that doesn't ask for anything, that is nowhere specific to go, that is simply the body's response to having seen something true. The woman in 2B had not turned a page. She was looking at her magazine, the way people look at things when they are actually looking at nothing, when the eyes need somewhere to land that isn't the face of the person they cannot bring themselves to look at. She would not look at Denise, she would not look at Malik. She sat very still with her hands flat on the open magazine, and she stayed that way. Tiffany had already clipped 3 segments from the live stream before the jetway door finished closing. She was in her own comments typing with one hand, not the polished caption language she used for content, but something faster and less managed. She typed, "I filmed the whole thing. Every second." She watched the clip of the watch being set on the armrest get shared, once, then 12 times, then too fast to count. She put the phone face down on her tray table for exactly 4 seconds, and then picked it back up. A man Denise didn't recognize leaned forward from the row behind her. He was middle-aged in a button-down, and he said he was so sorry. He said he should have said something. His voice had the quality of a confession, which it was. Denise looked at him for a moment. She said yes. She said he should have. She said it the way you say something that is simply accurate without heat, without the satisfaction that heat would have implied. Then she turned back toward her son. Malik was looking out the window. The 2 black SUVs were gone from the tarmac. The ground crew had returned to their positions. Outside, Atlanta was going about its morning indifferent, enormous, unchanged. Richard Holloway had built Holloway Capital Partners over 22 years, starting with a regional investment firm in Buckhead and expanding until the company managed $340 million in client funds across real estate, private equity, and venture portfolios. He had been on the cover of Atlanta Business Chronicle twice. He had his name on a building at his alma mater. He gave to the right foundations and sat on the right boards and moved through rooms the way money moves quietly and in the direction it chooses. The federal investigation had been building for 14 months. 3 charges: wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to commit financial crimes across state lines, each one documented with the particular patience of people who know that men like Holloway are careful and that careful men require careful cases. The grand jury date had been set. The timeline was fixed. And then Holloway's attorneys had shown him a photograph, a teenager, a face. They had told him this witness had given a statement and that the statement was specific and credible, and that it described something that had happened at a loading dock on the south side of Atlanta on a Tuesday evening in September. They had told him to know who to watch for. He had not expected to see the face at Gate C-22 on a Tuesday morning in April. But he had. And the calculation had taken less time than it takes most people to decide what to order for breakfast. Get the boy off the plane, or get him discredited, or get him associated with something that would make the jury look at him differently. The watch was already in his pocket before they finished boarding. It had not been rage. It had not even been desperation. It had been strategy, cold and immediate, the kind of thinking that builds $340 million portfolios, and the kind of thinking that, when it fails completely. The witness intimidation charge would be the 4th count. In the galley, Olivia stood with her back against the counter and her arms at her sides. Jerome came in and stood across from her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. He said she didn't know. She said she should have trusted what she knew. He didn't argue with that. He let it stand. She had known something was wrong when Holloway said, "Check his jacket." She had known something was wrong before, that when he had said, "I'm not making accusations, I'm stating facts," which is exactly what people say when they are making accusations and want cover for it. She had known, and she had weighed what she knew against her probationary status and her daughter at home and the complaint from March that still sat in her file like a splinter, and she had made a choice. She understood the choice now with a clarity that was not comfortable and was not going away. She pushed off the counter and walked back into the cabin. She stopped at row 3. She looked at Denise first and then at Malik, and she said she owed his son an apology. Denise looked at Malik. Malik turned from the window and looked at Olivia. His face was the same face it had been all morning, composed, watchful, giving nothing away that he hadn't decided to give. He said it was okay. Olivia said it wasn't. She meant it. It came out of something real in her, not the professional reflex of a person managing a situation, but the plain statement of someone who had looked at what she had done and named it accurately. Malik held her gaze for a moment. He said he knew. He said, but it was okay. The difference between those two sentences was the whole of it. It was not absolution. It was not forgiveness handed over like a receipt. It was a 16-year-old boy saying that he understood the difference between what had happened and what would happen next, and that he had decided to put one of them down because he could not afford to carry everything. Olivia nodded. She went back to the galley. The intercom clicked on. The captain's voice came through the same neutral professional register as before, and he apologized for the delay and said they would be departing shortly and thanked everyone for their patience. Nobody reached for a laptop. Nobody put earbuds in. The cabin sat with the announcement the way it had been sitting with everything else that morning, absorbing it, slowly, not quite ready to move on. Tiffany looked at her phone, and then looked up, and then looked at her phone again. She turned the camera toward herself, which she almost never did midstream without preparation, without lighting and framing and a caption ready. She looked into the lens, and she said she didn't have a caption for this. She said she'd figure that out later. Then she lowered the phone and looked out the window as the plane began to move. The ground crew stepped back. The jetway retracted. Atlanta slid slowly past the oval windows, and the sky came into view pale and wide and making no promises, and the plane rolled forward into the morning like it had somewhere to be. The flight landed in Chicago at 9:47 a.m. By 3 p.m., the clip had 2.1 million views. It had not spread the way things spread when people share them out of casual interest. It had spread the way things spread when they touched something that was already there, already sore, already waiting for a name. People were not just watching it. They were sending it with messages attached to siblings and coworkers and group chats that had been quiet for weeks, with captions that said, "Watch this," and "You need to see this," and "This is what I've been trying to explain." Tiffany had not planned what to post or how to frame it. She had landed, turned her phone off airplane mode, watched the notifications come in for 30 seconds, and then called the media licensing contact she kept in her phone for exactly this kind of situation. She was a professional. She had been doing this for 4 years, and she understood that the footage had value, and that the value was not only monetary, and that both things could be true at the same time. By noon, she had licensing agreements with 2 national news networks and 1 digital outlet. She negotiated the fees herself in the back of a rideshare from O'Hare, while the driver listened to sports radio and pretended not to know who she was. 3 clips had separated from the full live stream and were moving on their own by then. The first was the moment Malik opened his backpack. The textbooks and the charging cable and the worn Bible and the math notebook and the sandwich in the Ziploc bag, 38 seconds of footage that had been clipped and subtitled and shared 400,000 times before noon. The second was Agent Marcus Hill walking up the aisle, passing Malik without slowing, stopping, turning, and saying Mr. Richard Holloway as a statement rather than a question. The third was the watch. 11 seconds. The agent's hand going into the pocket, the small sound of it meeting the armrest, the Rolex sitting there still running, while Holloway said nothing. By noon, the trending list on X had 3 entries that had not existed that morning. The hashtag Flying While Black had been used 340,000 times. Holloway Capital was trending in Atlanta, New York, and Washington. Malik Thompson was trending nationally, which was complicated because Malik was 16 and a federal witness, and his name was not supposed to be in circulation, and the DOJ's Public Affairs Office spent part of their afternoon managing that specific problem. Holloway Capital Partners' website went dark sometime before midnight on Tuesday. No announcement, no redirect, no statement. It simply stopped resolving. The company's LinkedIn page was taken down 4 hours later. By Wednesday morning, $47 million in investor withdrawal requests had been filed, a number that would appear in the financial press by Thursday, and that one analyst described in print as a controlled demolition that became uncontrolled. The airline released its first statement at 8 p.m. Tuesday. It was 11 sentences of careful legal language that expressed concern for all passengers and commitment to a thorough review and appreciation for the professionalism of its crew. It did not apologize. It did not name anyone. It was written by people who understood that the first statement is not for the public, but for the lawyers, and that everything else comes after. 3 days later, under pressure that had not decreased and had in several measurable ways increased, the airline issued a second statement. This one used the word sorry. It named Denise and Malik Thompson by name, with their permission obtained through a call to Denise's cell phone by a vice president of customer experience who had clearly been rehearsed and was trying anyway. The statement announced an external review of cabin crew training protocols with a specific focus on implicit bias in business class incident response. It was a review, not a reform. The distinction was real, and the people paying attention noted it. Olivia Bennett was placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation, the same day the second statement was released. The airline's communications team did not mention her by name in any public statement. The flight attendant union did. Their statement was 2 paragraphs and said that crew members were routinely placed in situations where institutional pressure and passenger authority created impossible choices, and that accountability could not begin and end with the employee who was least positioned to resist that pressure. It was the most honest thing any organization said that week. Jerome was interviewed by airline management on Wednesday morning. He gave them an account that was precise and complete and corroborated everything Denise and Malik had said. He had been in the industry long enough to know how to give a statement that was truthful and also protected him, and his statement was both. He went home that afternoon, made dinner for himself, and watched the news for 20 minutes before turning it off. The Department of Justice confirmed 3 federal charges against Richard Holloway in a press release issued Wednesday afternoon: wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes across state lines. The press release was 4 paragraphs. A 4th charge, witness intimidation, was added in a supplemental filing Thursday morning. That charge carried a statutory maximum of 30 years. Holloway's attorneys released a statement saying their client denied all allegations and looked forward to his day in court. It was the statement attorneys release when they have nothing else to release yet. A reporter at a financial news outlet pulled Holloway Capital's last 4 SEC filings and published a piece Thursday evening noting that the most recent filing contained irregularities that, in retrospect, were visible in documents going back 7 years. The piece was shared widely in circles where people read SEC filings, which turned out to be a larger circle than usual that week. Holloway appeared before a federal magistrate Friday morning. His attorneys argued for bail. The government argued flight risk, citing the private aviation resources available to a man of his means and the international scope of the financial relationships under investigation. The magistrate denied bail. Holloway was remanded. He was photographed leaving the courthouse in the same suit he had worn on the plane, which several people on the internet noted. Malik's identity was protected in every official communication. His name had circulated anyway, because that is what names do. But the DOJ had been careful, and Denise had been more careful, and the damage was limited. Denise spoke to one reporter. She chose her specifically a black woman named Angela Reeves, who wrote for a national outlet, and who had covered federal civil rights cases for 11 years, and who had called Denise's cell phone and said simply that she wanted to get it right, and that Denise did not have to say anything at all. Denise said one thing. She said her son had gone through all of this and never raised his voice, not once. She said that wasn't just strength. She said that was who he is. Angela Reeves did not editorialize around the quote. She put it at the end of the piece and let it sit there. Georgetown University's Office of Undergraduate Admissions reached out through official channels on Thursday to confirm that Malik's full academic scholarship was unaffected and that they looked forward to welcoming him in the fall. The letter was addressed to Denise because he was still a minor. She read it twice at the kitchen table in her sister's house in Chicago, the house they had come to help settle. And then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and didn't take it out again for the rest of the day. At Jefferson High School on the south side of Atlanta, in a small office with a window that faced the parking lot, a counselor named Patricia Ward saw the clip on her phone during her lunch break on Tuesday. She had spent 8 months keeping a secret that had cost her more than she had expected secrets to cost, and she had kept it because Malik had asked her to, and because she had believed it was the right thing, and because she had not been entirely sure until this moment that she had been right. She closed her office door. She sat at her desk. She put her face in her hands and she cried the way people cry when something they were afraid was not going to be okay turns out to be okay, which is its own specific kind of relief, quieter than joy and heavier and more earned. She stayed that way for a while. Then she wiped her face, opened her door, and went back to work. Beverly Thompson was buried on a Thursday morning in Chicago under a sky the color of pewter, with a wind off the lake that made everyone hold their coats closed and lean slightly into each other without meaning to. Malik and Denise arrived at the church 20 minutes late because the rideshare had gotten turned around near the expressway and neither of them had the energy to be frustrated about it. They slipped into the back pew together, Denise in a black dress she had packed in a hurry, and Malik in the blazer he kept folded in his backpack for occasions that required one. The service had already started. The pastor's voice was warm and unhurried, and the church smelled like candles and old wood and someone's good perfume. The family had seen the news. Of course they had. It had been 3 days and the story had been everywhere. But nobody said anything about it during the service, and nobody said anything about it at the repast afterward in the church hall, where there was too much food and not enough chairs, and Beverly's friends from her church group kept arriving with more of both. People hugged Malik when they saw him, some of them for a long time, in the way that people hug you when they want to say something and have decided that the hug is more accurate than the words. He let them. He understood what the hugs meant. His cousin Darius found him near the food table, a plate in each hand, and handed one over without asking. Darius was 15 a year behind Malik, and he had his mother's eyes and the particular energy of a boy who is always about to say the thing everyone else is thinking. He asked if Malik had been scared. Malik thought about it. He took a breath and looked at the middle distance for a moment, which was something he did when he was actually considering a question instead of just answering it. He said he had been scared they wouldn't believe him, not about the watch, about what he saw. Darius was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if Malik thought they would actually lock Holloway up. Malik looked at his cousin. He said he thought the truth was out now. He said what happens next is not mine to carry. Darius nodded slowly, not the nod of someone who fully understands, but the nod of someone who recognizes that what they've just heard is important and intends to think about it later. He took a bite of his food. They stood there together in the church hall while Beverly's friends talked and the children ran between the chairs, and Denise stood near the window with her arm around her mother, finally home. Tiffany Cole posted the video on a Friday night, which was not when her analytics said to post, and which she knew and did not care about. It was 22 minutes long and unedited, which was also not what her analytics said to do. She sat in her apartment in front of a plain wall with no ring light and no filter, and she talked. She described what she had seen on the plane in the order she had seen it. She described the moment she had decided to keep recording and the moment smaller and less comfortable to admit when she had almost stopped. She said there was a second, right after Olivia asked Malik to open his bag, when she had thought about the liability, about whether being visibly part of this would cost her something with the brand partnership she had spent 2 years building. She said she was glad she hadn't put the phone down, but she wanted to be honest about the moment because she thought the moment was the point, that doing the right thing is not always the thing you do without thinking. Sometimes it is the thing you choose in spite of thinking. She said the licensing fees from the news networks would go in full to a Chicago-based organization that provided legal representation for minors in civil rights cases. She named the organization. She put the donation link in the description. The video got more views than the original clip. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was not. Because people recognized in it something they had felt themselves, the gap between who they wanted to be and who they were in the specific moment when it mattered. and the work of trying to close that gap even after the moment had passed. Tiffany was not a hero in the video. She knew that. She was a person who had made a better choice than she might have, and who understood that knowing the difference between those two things was the beginning of something, not the end. Olivia Bennett spent her administrative leave, the way people spend time when the noise has stopped and the accounting begins. She drove her daughter to school in the mornings and picked her up in the afternoons, and in the hours between, she sat with what she had done and what it had cost and what it meant that the costs had not been hers alone to pay. She enrolled in a civil rights history course at the community college 2 miles from her apartment. She did not tell anyone. She sat in the third row and took notes in a spiral notebook and did the reading and said very little in discussion, which the professor accepted without comment. She wrote a letter to Malik Thompson. She sent it through the airline's legal department because that was the only channel available and because she wanted it to reach him and not a file. She did not ask for forgiveness. She did not explain herself at length. She said she had seen him clearly only after it was too late, and that she was sorry, and that she hoped the clarity she had now would make her different in the room the next time, because there would be a next time for her or for someone like her, and she intended to be ready. Malik read the letter at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning while Denise was at church. He read it twice. He folded it and set it on the table and looked at it for a moment, and then he got up and made himself breakfast. He did not write back. That was not cruelty. It was the understanding that some things are complete without a response, that Olivia's letter was something she needed to send more than he needed to receive, and that receiving it quietly was its own kind of answer. 3 weeks after the flight, on an early Wednesday morning before the first bell, Malik Thompson sat alone in the Jefferson High School library with his backpack on the floor beside his chair and a problem set open on the table in front of him. The library smelled like dust and industrial carpet and the particular stillness of a school building before it fills. The windows faced east and the light was coming in low and flat and cold. On the corner of the table, in a manila folder with his name written on the tab in his own handwriting, were the Georgetown University application materials. The scholarship letter was inside. He had read it enough times that he knew which crease it opened to. He was working on a proof. It was giving him trouble in the specific, satisfying way that hard problems give trouble, the kind of difficulty that means you are close. His pencil moved and stopped and moved again. He erased something and rewrote it. He looked at what he had written. He paused. He turned his head and looked out the window. The school's parking lot was mostly empty. A groundskeeper was moving slowly along the far fence with a leaf blower. A bus was pulling in at the far end. The sky was the pale, unremarkable blue of a morning that has not decided yet what it will become. Malik looked at it for a moment. Then he turned back to the page and picked up his pencil and kept working. No declaration, no speech, no arrival. Just a boy at a table in the early morning doing the thing he had always been doing, refusing to be stopped, refusing to be reduced, carrying his own life forward with both hands. Richard Holloway was indicted on 4 federal counts. The trial date is pending. 2 of his co-defendants have entered cooperation agreements with the government. The Rolex Daytona was logged into federal evidence where it is still running. The airline updated its incident response protocol 3 months after the flight. Business class passenger bag searches now require supervisor authorization before any request is made to a traveler. It is a small change. It is a real one. Malik Thompson graduated at 16 with a full academic scholarship to Georgetown University. He did not become famous. He became himself. He was always going to. There are stories we tell because they are extraordinary. And then there are the other kind, the touching stories, the ones that live in terminals and back pews and school libraries and church halls, the life stories that don't announce themselves, the black stories that get dismissed or overlooked or searched in front of 40 strangers before anyone decides to pay attention. These are the real-life stories that matter most, not because they end perfectly, but because they insist on continuing. Because the person at the center of them decides quietly and without ceremony that their dignity belongs to them, and that no amount of power or presumption or practiced cruelty gets to take it. That is not a miracle. That is a choice. And some choices made by one person in one ordinary moment turn out to change the room and then the story and then something larger than either. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something real, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you never miss the stories that matter. And tell us in the comments what moment hit you hardest.